So hello everyone. Hi. Welcome to the first of the Blue Rain Gallery Artist Lecture Series. This is something that we've been wanting to do for a while. And Billy Schenck has agreed to be the first to present in our Artist Lecture Series. So thank you all for coming out this evening to see this presentation. Just a little bit about the Artist Lecture Series. It's something that we are going to have on the second Tuesday of every month throughout the year. For the month of June, Erin Currier will be presenting. She's a mixed media painter that we represent. And then for the month of July, Jim Vogel will be presenting. Again, that's the second Tuesday of every month. We are going to take the month of August off from the lecture series because we simply have too many events in August to manage it all. But then we'll resume again in September and October and November. So I just want to thank you all for coming. And for those of you who do not know me, I'm Denise Pettyplace. I'm the executive director here at Blue Rain Gallery. And you know, one of the joys of this business is that we get to work closely with the artists that we represent. And by doing that, we come to gain a deeper appreciation for their artwork through learning about their stories, from spending time with them in their studios, from our regular interactions with them here in the gallery. So it gives us a lot of background and a lot of additional appreciation. And we just thought how wonderful if we could share that with the public as well. So Billy Schenck is presenting this evening, and the title of his lecture is called Billy Schenck, Origins of Western Pop Art. I had something different, actually. I had How I Became a Western Pop Artist and the Emergence of Contemporary Western Art. But all the same, it's going to be fabulous. Billy has prepared a really wonderful visual presentation for you all. And I can tell you that his stories are very entertaining. I've heard many of them. And I'm hoping to hear a few new ones this evening as well. Just a little bit about Billy. I can confidently say that Billy's one of the most iconic painters in the West. Billy's known as one of the originators of the Western pop art movement. Billy has paved the way for other artists to be successful in this genre of painting as well. Billy first got his start as a professional artist in New York in the 60s. And he was there for the rise of pop art. He was rubbing elbows with all kinds of celebrities. And he landed his first gallery show. And then his first international exhibition came shortly after that as well. So hopefully we'll hear a little bit about that time in his life also. It's a very fascinating time. Billy's work can be found in over 50 museum and private collections of note. So we're honored to represent Billy Schenck here at Blue Rain Gallery, and we're also honored to have him as our first presenter in the Artist Lecture Series. So let's give Billy a warm welcome. It's not a microphone for the audience, it's a microphone for the camera, for the video.
Okay.
So you have to project.
And I can put this in my pocket, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so you will have to project for the crowd.
Well, thank you for being here. And we'll start all the way back to the embryo stage of how one becomes a Western pop artist. And it looks like this. 1958, Mad Magazine did this particular article, and at the time I was 11 years old. And my biggest influence as far as what I was drawing and cartooning was, and I'll show you, was Donald Duck and this specific story from Mad Magazine. The thing that got my interest, and I did it in my own drawings. I was doing like battle scenes and all that kind of stuff, cartooning. I love the fact that they wrote out the sound effects. So I started imitating this exact same font, and I specifically like, bleeding I didn't know could sound so loud. I thought that was pretty cool. And I like the idea of, the butler he's being shot, but he's already got his hands up to his chest and he's being shot straight through from the back, to the, the front of his hands. And again, didn't know that dead figures just bounce and made a big sound bouncing. So this was all very exciting to me as an 11-year-old kid. And this was another cell, as they call them, I think, in the cartoons, that I was fascinated by. So I was doing my own imitations and impressions of these. It's what? This thing is only going to that. Can you hear me? Better what? Oh, with the air conditioning off. Oh, okay. So, whoops, wow, I'm jumping all over the place. Wait a minute. There. And that was my other influence altogether. So I was doing all kinds of drawings, specifically Carl Barks, who did all of the Walt Disney comics and stories, Donald Duck and the Three Nephews. So, and this was also the beginning of my collecting instincts. I ended up owning all 600 of the issues that Carl Barks illustrated for Walt Disney. And that would be for the Uncle Scrooge comic books, the Donald Duck adventures and stories, and in this group. So this is the way it went for me until I was 18, and I, like every other kid, middle-class kid, I guess, I applied to all these different colleges as a junior and senior in high school, and I didn't get accepted to any of them, and that was kind of embarrassing. And as a last resort, as a desperate alternative, I decided I'll apply to an art school, which was local to me, the Columbus College of Art and Design, and I got accepted. And I remember the day that I found out that I got the letter of acceptance, I came home and my mother was home she was a teacher. And I said, well, that can't be a very good art school. They accepted me. So, so I did. So as I went there in September, growing up, I had traveled around the country with my mother and brother. We'd gone to all kinds of science museums, history museums, geology museums, everything. But never once did we step foot in an art museum or an art gallery. So in the very first couple of weeks of the first semester, I was a freshman. The museum attached to the school had an exhibition of Andy Warhol. And so this was my first exposure to what is considered fine art. Forget all the classic, salon-style painting, the Impressionists and all that. I thought, wow, this is fine art. This is cool. I've been doing this kind of stuff since I was 11 years old. I like this. So I was an open slate. I thought it was great stuff. And then as time went on, this is more Warhols, and this would also impact my own work in the fact that there were multiple imageries. That was brand new to the entire art world. Nobody had done anything quite like that. And then also, the other artist that would impact me as time would go on, this would be later in my career, in the early 80s, I started doing caption paintings of my own. So between Warhol and Roy Lichtenstein, these were the two artists that had the largest impact on me becoming a pop artist of any kind. And then to put the whole piece together, Sergio Leone was making his spaghetti westerns, starting in, I saw the first one when first of all, I left the first school, Columbus College of Art and Design, and went out to Kansas City Art Institute in 1967. And I was spending the summers in Wyoming. As I came back from Wyoming, it was just a little after Labor Day, I had a friend who was a film buff like myself, we had seen and appreciated a lot of the foreign films, the art films that were coming out of Europe and so forth. So I didn't really have much attachment to American filmmaking at all at the time. And specifically, not Westerns or anything else. But this friend of mine who was a ceramics major said, there's a double feature of of an Italian Western. And I thought, what's that mean? I mean, okay. So he talked me into going, and of course, what we saw was a fistful of dollars and a few dollars more. And that got my attention like no other artist in art history, as painters or anything else like that. It was this filmmaker who eventually altered the course of how I would make imagery for the rest of my life. I continued, being what I thought was, an avant-garde, progressive, contemporary painter. I was painting all different kinds of subject matter, some of it influenced by Francis Bacon for a series of years. But then again, in 1968, the third of this trilogy, The Good and the Bad, the Ugly, came out. And by then I was becoming riveted. Then I graduated from Kansas City Art Institute in December of 1969. I moved to New York right after the New Year. And we started building out a loft in Soho. And I remember it was around April or May of that year. Sergio Leone had come out now with his fourth film, Once Upon a Time in the West. And at that point, I just sort of gave up and thought, I gotta make Western paintings, and I wanna be able to do with Western art what Sergio Leone has done to Western filmmaking as a genre. So I had to figure out what would be an authentic way for me to approach that subject matter. And I was thinking, and another friend suggested to me, well, what about movie stills? I mean, I've been living in Wyoming, I've been to rodeos, I've been in rodeo parades, I had horses, we had cattle, all that kind of stuff, but I wasn't that attached to that lifestyle. And since I was such a film buff, to do paintings based on black and white movie stills, which I didn't know existed until these friends told me. We lived in New York and there was two places that you could, buy movie stills from for a couple of bucks a piece. So that's what I did. I just went up to 14th Street and found this little shop, and I came back, with more than a dozen photographs, and with an opaque projector, I started projecting them onto canvas and then tracing the outlines of the figures and so forth. And the other thing that made this style legitimate for me was John Clem Clark. And so I'm going to back up. When I was in Kansas City, Ivan Karp, who was originally the director for Leo Castelli Gallery in New York, went off on his own, and he was one of the first gallery dealers that moved downtown to Soho. He came out to Kansas City for a series of lectures, and he had just 4 artists that he had slides of. One was Chuck Close, the other was Dwayne Hanson, who was a photorealist sculptor, John Clem Clark, and I believe Malcolm Morley. And this really got my attention because I could see that it was projected imagery. It wasn't quite like classic photorealism came to be known as. And he was, I went to New York, after I went to New York, I wanted to meet John Clem Clark. As soon as I got there, I also went back to see Ivan and to learn the process that John was doing. And I did sort of my interpretation of what John was doing, which was he was taking butcher block paper and making stencil cutouts, as many as 25, 30 of these stencils at a time, and registering them to a canvas stretched on the wall, and then shooting with a spray gun, the same kind of spray gun you'd use to paint cars. And he came up with this, I'll call soft edge paint by number system. And all I did differently was when I projected imagery, I outlined it and painted it directly on the canvas. So these were my first paintings before the Westerns that I did with this paint by number style, which ultimately became my signature style that I'm still using today. It's just hopefully gotten more sophisticated than what these were. It took longer to build these stretchers than it did to paint the paintings. This is roughly 7 feet by 5 feet. And It was a short-lived series. Here was another one. And there's another one of John Clem Clark's paintings of his Bacchanal series. So I sort of had, you know, my style roughly in place and doing all these, you know, flat, hard edge, you know, colors against each other. And now with Sergio in my brain, I started using the movie stills. And this is what some of the early versions of movie stills look like. And you can see, as opposed to other photorealists, they would take a single photograph and project everything and give you all the exact same information, so you had a large-scale painting that looked identically like a color Kodachrome slide. But I started editing. I didn't want that big log in the middle, so I threw it out. And then I just did my own interpretation of a sky. So that's sort of how I started, you know, making Western paintings. And this was in 1970, 71 that I started doing those. And as far as the other, I'll say godfathers or originators of pop Western or contemporary Western, there was Fritz Scholder and Luis Jimenez. I had seen Luis's work at OK Harris, that was Ivan Karp's gallery. So I was aware of the fact that there was somebody, you know, at least doing three-dimensional contemporary, you know, I guess, you know, pop imagery. And I came on to Fritz's work actually a few years later via art, what's that magazine from Arizona? Arizona Highways. So we never made a formal declaration or anything of we're now the contemporary godfathers of Western art, as opposed to the antithesis of our group was the CAA, the Cowboy Artists of America, and they had formalized that group in 1965. And I don't know how many members they had at the time, but what they were doing was, you know, much more traditional, classic, salon-style, post-impressionist approach to the Western genre. What we represented was obviously something entirely different. This is another one of the very early ones I did. And again, you can see this movie still that I had stopped, you know, right at the train, and I thought that was too close to crop it. So I just invented this landscape to open it up and let it breathe. And this was 6 by 10 feet. I still had the idea of doing really large scale stuff, but then everybody at that time that was in contemporary art, we were still being influenced by the abstract expressionists who did, you know, 5 by 20 feet, 6 by 14 feet. So it wasn't uncommon to have large scale paintings like that. And aside from the movie stills, I'm now getting familiar with, I've started to become a historian of Western films in general so that I know what I can ask for at the movie still place. I had to, you know the titles of movies, or it was cross-referenced by movie stars. So as much as I could, I began watching every Western movie in the history of the world just to see what was there. And then simultaneous to that, I began to get nervous about not having enough subject matter to work from. So I called some friends of mine from New York who lived in Bernalillo, and I said, are they making Westerns out here? And they said, yeah, sure, come out. So I just drove out in May of 1971, and somebody took me out to this movie set that was in Galisteo and introduced me to the director and the assistant director, and met Glenn Ford, and Jay Silverheel was in the movie, who was originally the TV series Tonto for Lone Ranger. And they were all really nice and probably thought I was going to stay for the afternoon or at the most a couple of days. And I camped out in that campground that's out east of off of I-25. And I stayed with them until I think 6 weeks. And at that point, they threw me off the set. They got tired of me being there. But by then, I had enough material of my own slides, and ironically, I could see, without even knowing anything about movies, this thing was a disaster, and it was over budget. I mean, they really didn't know what they were doing. And then the movie never came out. And my cousin was on a flight, on a Pan Am flight from New York to London, and she called me when she got in London. She says, I think I saw the movie that you were on in New Mexico. And I said, really? And she described it to me. I said, God, I think you're right. And the name was Santee, which then I knew it was right. I didn't get to see this film until 1982 when it came out in VHS. That was the first time that there was any public distribution for this thing. It was in the can the whole time except for that Pan Am flight going back and forth from New York to London. And I was the only person that made money on this film. I made around $15,000 on the paintings that I made and sold from that. I don't know if they ever broke even. This was another of the early, I had another friend who was out on the movie set of The Little Big Man. I don't know where that was being shot, but he brought me back 2 rolls of slides, and this was another one that I made. And this is also the earliest documentation of me having help making these paintings. So I had figured out, I'm now using high gloss exterior enamel paint. And the reason I'm doing that is I could get these things flat without showing a brushstroke, which, you know, I'll say classic pop artists like Warhol, Lichtenstein, Rosenquist, you name it. It was all flat, flat, flat. And I wanted my work, even though it was more, I don't want to say maybe representational or whatever, but I still wanted that flatness. So as I'm painting these things, I'm quickly discovering that one coat of paint is not going to get this thing flat. It's still looking a little washy, a little translucent. So I knew I had to start painting the entire painting again in second coats. So what I did when I made a color, I would make enough of it so we could cover it 2 times or 3 times. And my then wife, Kiffer, volunteered one day to help me paint the big, you know, second coats on the thing. And boy, that idea took. And I've had help with these in that regard ever since. So everything you're seeing here, I mean, everything, it's all 2 or 3 times painted. So the conceptual part of everything is me, you know, inventing the image, drawing the image, tracing it out, figuring out the color scheme, change it until it feels right. And then I'm done with, because the rest of it's brain dead to paint these things, you know, a second and third time. But anyway, and then here's, after the painting is finished, of course, I'm taking credit for doing the whole thing because I'm the artist. Here's another one that, again, you can see where I made my own editorial changes, added the mesas in the back. And this was my, I wanted to be like these other photorealists that were all around me. And they were all using airbrushes, you know, Pache airbrushes. And I guess that's a, you know, an illustrator technique to make imagery. But I didn't have anybody show me or teach me how to do anything. But I went ahead and proceeded to make this painting completely airbrushed. And really all I'd done was imitate, once again, like John Clem Clark. I had, everything was kind of flat, but with soft edges. So I did this for about 4 or 5 paintings, and I just went back to hand painting everything, again, just like the way I had before. And I got to say about this painting, we have my own, or our own collection of my work, and we have every era, genre represented in my personal collection, which we use to go out on loan for museum exhibitions. So there was a few holes, and at this point, one of them, I had done this painting in 1973. It sold in 1977, and I didn't get to see it again until it came up at auction a year and a half ago. We bought it back. So now that is in a traveling retrospective exhibition. Here's probably my first direct crossover to Warhol. This was another artist friend of mine Ann Coe, who lives in Arizona, and her childhood hero is Elvis Presley. So I decided to take, Warhol did, I think, 27 versions of this particular image of Elvis. And so I just projected one of his paintings and put it in behind. And of course, I just changed it to be more hard edge and more contrasty. So that was one of my very early cowgirl paintings as well. I started painting the cowgirls around 1980, 81. And here's another one that this was a John Wayne film. And again, you can just see how, and I'm using a black and white movie still, but that didn't hinder me, just inventing my own color any way I wanted. And then you can see I knocked out that background, which was more short distance, and I wanted longer, deeper space. So I just, put in a Monument Valley mesa in the back. And my mom wanted a really good example of one of my pieces, so I hired her as a studio assistant to help me, do the second and third coats. And she did make it through 3 paintings before I fired her, but this was one, and she kept it. And now, in the 80s and earlier, here I am with caption paintings. And again, I just put the Roy Lichtenstein piece in because you can, Warhol and Lichtenstein were definitely impacting my work, but I was changing it, to make my own narrative. And so this was actually one of the very early pieces. The Cliff became my first, I don't know what you want to call him. He wasn't a Western hero. He was definitely a compromised character, but I put him in the narrative and he continues to this day, and it gets even more wayward, and he needs psychiatric help on occasion. It's just, he's having a tough time. This is, as I was painting a lot more contemporary Western imagery, I started painting first cowboys and pickup trucks because I was at this time rodeoing, and everybody that was going to the rodeos had pickup trucks. And then I liked the idea of upgrading them to Cadillacs. And that was a direct influence from the movie HUD, which had come out in 1964. That was probably one of the only films I'd seen before I went to art school. And I liked the idea, even though it was a black and white film, that HUD drove this pink 58 Cadillac. So I found a 58 Cadillac that was pink, and I restored it, put black and white cowhide interior in it, and kept that for about 15 years, and so I got to play HUD. And this was a friend of mine who was an Osage Indian from Oklahoma who was running a stock brokerage for his firm, and he had the Scottsdale branch. And he always drove around in Eldorados. So we photographed him with this. And the other thing that I thought was, kind of new to Western genres is the palm trees in the background. I mean, this is not, classic Western landscape. This is more than a decade before Hollywood invented the term urban cowboy, with John Travolta in, I don't know what the name of that thing was. Pardon me? Yeah, but what's the name of the film? Urban Cowboy, right. I'm losing my memory. Anyway, I was in front of Hollywood by 12 years. Now we're upgrading again. We're moving from Cadillacs, Eldorados, to Rolls Royces. And this was easy to do. I was represented by Elaine Horwich Gallery at the time, and she had a gallery here in Santa Fe, Palm Springs, and Sedona. So we just borrowed this Rolls Royce of hers and just took it out on location. to do this, the setup for this shoot. It's hard to see in this image, but this was 1982, and Texas was having its second major oil crisis, the first one being in 1973. And so what I did was, this license plate actually says Star-Studded State broke, with the outline of Texas. And it's hard to see here, but the wingtips on her boots are oil derricks. So I thought I'd make my little social commentary on the financial status of Texas at that time. This was sort of going along with my caption paintings. I called this my Graffiti Series. And this was, I took from a page out of Saturday Evening Post. And I projected the entire image, but what I've done here is I put down all the specifics of a piece of land that I was buying north of Scottsdale. And with the Indian sitting on the bluff looking at what was his land, I was obviously, making a statement about this is literally the reality of what used to be Native American land. It was theirs. This is what it became. And then I continued with this series, and this is, in the checkout lines at the grocery stores, there was National Enquirer, Star Magazine, stuff like that. So I took these home, and what I would do is cut and paste until I got something that felt right. And at that point, I took a slide and then projected the whole thing up to make these images. And again, I just wanted to do some off the wall, social commentary with all this stuff. This is an early self-portrait. I did a series of Kellogg's paintings, and I found out just recently because I was at a copyright lawyer here in Santa Fe, and he told me, I always thought that, there was a real restriction on copyright use, of names like Kellogg's, so I deliberately dropped the G, hoping that I'd never get sued. They never cared or sued me anyway. And then the lawyer told me, well, there's a difference between that kind of a copyright. This is brand name, which means you can use it. Oh, wish I'd known that in 1981. I found out in 2019. I think that was also an homage to John Waters, who was making really wacky films at the time, Desperate Living. And of course, Kellogg's had a whole series of their cereal boxes at the time, which were all Olympic athletes. So it was really good, wholesome, like Wheaties. And I just wanted to, derange the whole deal. So start each day with 8 essential drugs, because that's what we were doing in 1981. Another self-portrait. And I'm being hung, but I've also got a pistol in my hand so I can shoot myself and, commit suicide 2 different ways. And I didn't know what a punk cereal bowl should look like, so I thought maybe just a yellow bowl with, lavender dots would be what a punk bowl should look like. And if you'll notice, the reflection isn't of the bowl. I just got, a streak of blood going across the sunglasses. This was another artist friend of mine, and at this time I'm beginning to start doing these halftone dot variations on my own work. I don't know how to explain this. This is a whole different process that we would use at that time, a vertical process camera. You would take a black and white or color image, and you'd slide this thing in underneath, and you could change the whole image into dots, and you could change the scale, making them, if you made them smaller and tighter, you would get more information. The more you exaggerated them, the more you'd lose detail. So I just had to, mess with that to where I could get it to feel like a half-tone dot painting, but I could still retain enough information, to be able to give you an image. And these things took forever. I mean, this one over here is 7.5 feet tall. and 5 feet wide. Pardon me? Oh yeah, these are still in enamel. And this being the era, my then studio assistant and I knew, now this was with an opaque projector, and I knew it was going to take a zillion hours, you know, to project this image. So we literally started at 7 o'clock with a pile of cocaine and to get us through the night. And he started on the left side, I started on the right side, and we drew dots until 7 o'clock the next morning. So if I'd been left to my own devices, that was a 24 to 28 hour drawing. And you have to do it at one sitting because the image can get burned up or crack or break under the heat of the opaque projector. And once you lose your register, you have to start all over. It'll just look like it won't be the same pattern. So out of pure desperation, we got it made. And then also at this time, I had been doing, I got sucked into the lifestyle, which I had denied the whole time I'm growing up. So by 1975, I'm now rodeoing, riding saddle broncs and bareback broncs and rodeos around northern Wyoming. And so I started doing my own rodeo series, and I didn't do very many of the action pieces that we all are more familiar with. But I wanted to see, I wanted patterns. So I wanted to see what the figures looked like up against, you know, the chute gates and in behind the scenes. So that most of those paintings from that era are all, you know, before the actual action happens. And it was just a different take. And I haven't seen anybody do rodeo from this perspective since. I mean, there's a lot of painters who, you know, do rodeo stuff, but not like that. This was another one that I went to, took a series of slides at a San Carlos Apache rodeo. So I did a whole series of paintings of Apache cowboy rodeo, but it didn't, philosophically it never flew. It still just looked like rodeo cowboys to everybody. The other one is, again, me, self-portrait from the same era. By now, my cowgirls have gotten much rougher, tougher, don't mess with them type of people. And I like the idea of, also, this is early on too, where I'm starting to project the same foreground figure, and after I've got it drawn in, I project that same image again, slightly off to one angle or another to create this shadow effect. So it looks like possibly this is a billboard, you know, with a repeated image. Again, you know, kind of an homage to Warhol. And then, you know, putting the shadow up against it just gives it the illusion of real space and then flat space, I hope. This again was Ann Coe, another artist in Arizona. And this was another Cadillac convertible that we borrowed. And now that I'm quoting history, you know, in all kinds of other social and political contexts, this is literally the road in between Tucson and Florence where Tom Mix was killed in his roadster in 1940. He went flying off of a road that was under construction. There was a bridge that was out, and he didn't see it. So that was my homage to Tom Mix. Remember earlier we were looking at my original influence from Mad Magazine. So this is how it manifested itself decades later in my work. And again, I like the idea of the cast shadow. And this can't happen with revolvers. When you shoot them, they just keep clicking over and shooting. And the shell casings don't fly out of a pistol like this at all. So I like that notion. And if you count them, it's a wrong count. It's 7. There's never 7 cartridges in a pistol. And then I really liked the idea of shooting bullet holes through rock mesas in Monument Valley. I just thought that was pretty neat. This painting just got sold. Here's Cliff, many, many paintings later. And as you can see, Cliff is really kind of out of control. He's, having all kinds of problems. And again, more bullet holes through the mesas. This was when Ronald Reagan was president, and they were beginning their war on drugs, and Nancy Reagan, had the answer: just say no. So I took this movie still of Bob Hope, and you can see I didn't have to change the hat. I mean, and he's got a joint in his hand. You can see, right, that Bob Hope has? And look, he's got like a 30-gallon hat that's blown the top of his head off, and that's Roy Rogers, saying Nancy Reagan's words to him. This was actually the very beginning of having Cliff before Cliff was named. And I like the idea of, obviously I switched out Jennifer Jones and put this naked girl in the desert. And I just thought, this is the greatest moral dilemma one could possibly face in the entire Western Hemisphere. A cowboy coming upon a naked girl in the desert. What do you do? This was in 1988 when I was down here in Santa Fe again, out in Diablo Canyon, and they were shooting the Tracker, which again was not a great Western. But I was down there and, got to shoot a bunch more film. So this is right there on the Rio Grande, and you can see all the other rafts and all the other crews and all that. And I just, this one figure waiting, for the next shot to be set up. And then I used it, to make my Navajo girl. This is the beginning. I started doing just pure landscapes around 1999, and I thought they were getting to a pretty good place around 2000. So these were two of the early ones, and they're still among the best, I thought, and that I had done up to this point. And again, this is out in Monument Valley. I go to Monument Valley twice a year, and I have for the last 40 years. That place is a huge inspiration. Well, yeah, most everything is a compilation in all of these. But yes, this is, the trees are also on Navajo country, but they're not specifically in this location. I never say anything. On occasion, when I have a landscape and I have at a show and people say, I know where that is, I've been there. I go, okay. Because actually it doesn't exist. Not exactly the way they're seeing it, because I've invented it. This is a native from San Felipe Pueblo. This was a first photo shoot that I did with him. I was with Logan Hajaj at the time. So you will see, this is on the right-hand side, no trading post. I think Rosita Santiago's used Tony in her paintings. I have, Logan has. The other one on the left side is Laura Gilpin, who photographed out in the Navajo country in the 1930s and 40s. And she had a huge portfolio of black and white imagery, and I chose one of her images, to turn into a painting of mine. The background is a Maynard Dixon mesa and cloud. So I hadn't mentioned before, but constantly in all my imagery, I'm appropriating from movie stills, from stuff I've shot, from everything, including historic painters. This is just a good example where I've compiled, two famous one photographer and one painter to make an image, of my own out of it. Same thing is true here. This is my landscape. This is my cloudscape. The Navajos in the buckboard wagon are from an old black and white photograph from Arizona highways from about 1955, 56. Same thing here. This is, well, I posted William R. Lee. That's one of the most famous William R. Lee paintings in existence. And so I have, altered, hit the figure, color-wise and so forth. And then, of course, I put him in a whole different landscape with a cloudscape. I threw in a slide of the drawing. This was for a potential commission, and all through the years, sometimes before I commit an image to canvas, I'll draw it on paper like that, and this is how a projected drawing looks like with the hatching to give it, some sort of texture. So I've been doing that off and on as well for decades. That's from a pulp western magazine. That's another place where I use as source material, particularly the pulps from 1918 up to about 1945. I think that's, in my opinion, the best era of the illustration work that was being done. Or at least it's easiest for me to translate, some of those artists into my style. And then, of course, I'd, put my own captions into those. Here's another more recent dot painting. This was a photo shoot we did that year when we were out at the Entre Museum for the Masters show. Ran over to Logan Hajjaj's house, and that's his wife, Misty. So she became one of my cowgirls. So you can see the original shot, then, what it translated like to turn it into black and white, and then the actual painting is the one on the right. There's another idea that I liked for empowerment of women. I like the idea of high-heeled, spiked high-heeled shoes, but with spurs. So there was a series of these too. This was, again, from a pulp western. This was a Fall Arts Festival poster I did for them in 2015. And this was actually the 30th year anniversary. I did the very first poster. The gallery I was associated with then in Jackson Hole was Main Trail Gallery. And at that time, and this was 1985, all the shows, all the focus was always in July and August up to about Labor Day. And thinking they were going to capture the most amount of potential sales with people coming in the summer. And we thought, there's a lot of people that come back to Jackson after the kids are back in school. People come back out to the dude ranches. Some guys are going hunting. I'll bet you we get a more focused audience if we did a show in September. And everybody thought we were nuts to even think of that, but we did, and it worked. And we created this Fall Arts Festival, which now is a big deal, but I'm the grandfather of that one too. And this was the 30th anniversary. This is another thing I don't think you normally see in the Western genre, are the romance of, cowboys and cowgirls together. This is one of my great favorite films. And I named it this because literally in the film, this is the last night they're going to be together. They're on the run. Whole posse's after them. The next day, they're out at the very back end of Canyon del Muerto, which is in Canyon de Chelly, up against ruin in the back, Mummy Pueblo, I think. And they just get shot to pieces at the end of the film. So that's why I named it The Last Sunset, because it is literally their last sunset together. This is actually a portrait from a black and white photograph of Lon McGargy, who was an Arizona artist around 1900, about 1950. And I took that and put him into the Tetons. Nobody liked this painting, so I kept it. It's in our personal collection, not for sale. This was a more recent painting. Again, this is another photo shoot. I did 2 photo shoots this last spring and fall. And here's another painting from the exact same photo shoot. In this case, these are our own horses. These are my own blankets. We have all of the jewelry, the blouses, the skirts, everything. So we just, all we need to find is the individuals that'll, fit for the look that I'm after. So we don't have to borrow it. And I shoot them right here at my place and then, put it out into usually a Monument Valley landscape. Same thing here. The background is a road trip I took to Central Utah, Canyonlands last year. And again, I just had all these individuals, and actually these are several different photo shoots. Our horses, our gear and all that, and then I just piece it together. So this is a combination of 4 slides, I think, to make this image. This is recent. Same thing here. I've actually done different variations on this figure in the foreground since the middle 80s. I was in Apache Junction at the time. We went out at dawn one morning right after it had rained in the desert, and I just took a pile of my own pots out of my own collection, and we went out there and shot. But when I made this painting, the background is from rock formations just west of Winslow, Arizona. And the background, Navajo figures from an old black and white photograph, I think from Arizona Highways. This is another wife of an artist friend of mine that we shot almost 30 years ago. This is going to be a new serigraph, as well as this is the painting, but a new serigraph that's coming out with a gallery that represents me in London. So sometime this fall we'll have that. And then here's another new series I started a couple years ago of surfer girls. And so I come back and forth every once in a while to do these. I know this isn't exactly Western, but and again, it's a little bit like rodeo. I'm not really doing the action, but like, the guys that are standing against the chutes or getting down on a horse or whatever before the actual event happens. It's sort of the same thing I'm doing here with the surfer girls. I mean, they're, on the board waiting for the right wave. So there's about 16 or 17 of these. And again, you can see I've done 2 different variations of the same image. And there's one more. And this is the end. Real artist overwhelmed Shank in his studio. He was removed for aesthetic purposes or aesthetic reasons. So that's it. Anybody have any questions? None? I said everything? What? Did you say? Yeah, actually I got a painting right now that what I did, it's a roper, and he's got his back turned to you, and there's cattle down along the horizon and a big cloud, and I wanted to have all this dust and commotion in the cattle. So I drew in the whole thing, painted the whole foreground, the first coat, and the background, completely solid, second coated. Then I airbrushed the dust in, and then came back and painted the foreground so you could see, you know, this clear figure out in front of all the dust. So the cows are literally half obliterated. There's others where I've done Galloping Cowboys, and again, I've finished the whole painting and then come back in and airbrush dust and hope to God that I haven't just wrecked 70 hours of work, you know, by screwing up the dust. So yeah, but not as much as I used to. Well, no, these are not airbrushed. This is all done by hand. I know, but they're not. This is, you know, a move that I started around 2009, 2010, because up till then, even all my clouds were flat everywhere. And I did, you know, I didn't like, the effect wasn't real enough for me. So I started doing these gradations like that. And they look really raw in the first coats. And then they get, you know, cleaned up in the second coats. Anything else? Yes?
I thought I noticed in your paintings of native subjects a bit more reference than
That's true.
than you do for like
That's very true. The Navajos I leave completely alone. I have great regard for that lifestyle. I like the idea. I mean, even though it's nostalgic, maybe a little sentimental, you know, the sheep herders, the people on horseback, it's really a lifestyle that's gone out there. I did get to see it, you know, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago. And so I continue making my own scenarios with, you know, Navajos on horseback and with sheep on occasion. And that's the only really reverent subject matter I have in my work. As you can see, I'm prone to terrorizing anything else that comes across my vision. Does that add? Yeah. Well, thanks. Yeah.
How often do you do commissions for people? I'm a realtor and I have some Kellogg at 10 Barker.
Oh, yeah.
And they all
Right.
oh, that's really
Yeah. I'm sorry, how, what?
what frequency did you, or was that a commission? It seemed like
I still can't hear what you're saying. Oh, yeah, I do commissions. Not, I don't get asked that much, but maybe a half a dozen a year, something like that. You know, and at this point, I mean, my average paintings for a long time, I averaged about 33 paintings a year. I'm above that now, but it's never been so many commissions that it, you know, gets in the way of the rest of what I'm, you know, doing from one painting to the next. But I am always available. Oh, thank you. Yeah, their car, their dog. They did not own the Apaches that were roaring around behind them. Frankie.
Ever gonna put a brushstroke in one of your paintings?
Almost. No. I'm not. I'm not going to paint like a real artist. That's what happened to me. Okay. I guess we're done.